theyeshiva.net.
Thank you so much, my dear friend Rabbi Brook, the ambassador of Chabad to the state of Montana, one of the great unsung heroes of the Jewish people, who together with his wife have created such an incredible Jewish renaissance, not only in Boseman, but in the entire state, together with all of their colleagues, the Chabad rabbis and rebbitzins. And I really want to welcome all of you joining us from all parts of Montana. It's really a great privilege and thrilling opportunity to be able to be invited by Rabbi and Rebbe Brook to this amazing evening, commemorating a Yartzeit of a great figure in Jewish history, a great personality, a person whose life story still remains powerfully inspirational and I think relevant to our lives today, many decades later. So first of all, thank you, and I'm so happy to be here with all of you who are joining us from Montana, wherever you're joining us from. And again, thank you for this great opportunity. So today, as you know, is the 20th day of the Hebrew month of Av, and it marks, as Rabbi Brook just mentioned, the 76th anniversary of the passing of a person I would call and define as the rock of Ukraine. And I would like to dedicate this evening and the following few minutes to sketch some of the features of this remarkable person's life, because a Yartzeit, an anniversary of passing, is a time to commemorate a life, to pay tribute to a life, and most importantly, to become empowered and inspired by the examples set for us by our great teachers, leaders, and mentors that can inspire us and infuse us with perspective and enthusiasm at this very day, even if we're living in a different country and under different circumstances. Nonetheless, every person has their ups and downs, and we have our challenges, and there's much to be learned from this extraordinary figure. The Lubavitcher Rebbe is quite well known, certainly in Montana, after Rabbi Brook's work. Rabbi Menachem Schneerson was the oldest of three boys. His middle brother was murdered by the Germans. He was shot. His younger brother, his middle brother's name was Beryl. His younger brother's name was Label. And he died a very young man. He was a mathematician. He escaped communist Russia because he liked Trotsky more than Stalin. So he had to escape. He went into exile. He moved to Berlin. And Berlin he left. He moved to what was then Palestine. Ultimately ended up in Liverpool in England, where he died in 1952 in his low 40s. So the Rebbe only had two brothers. One brother... so the Lubavitcher only had two brothers, and as I said, one was killed by the Germans and the other one had died in 1952. He left one daughter. Who were their parents? The Rebbe's father was a man named Levi Yitzchak Schneerson, and his mother was Chana. Now, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Schneerson was an incredible personality. First of all, he came from great lineage, from the famous Schneerson family. He was a great-grandson of the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Chabad Rebbe. And he had a great mind. He was a scholar par excellence. In fact, the decade after his wedding, he spent privately sitting and learning Torah, literally day and night. He mastered much of Torah literature in an incredible way. He had a gigantic mind. His son's mind, the Lubavitcher Rebbe's mind, didn't come from nowhere. It was not created in a vacuum. His father, literally, he mastered, first of all, the entire body of biblical literature, Talmudic literature, Mishnah literature, Babylonian and Jerusalem Talmud, all of the halachic literature, midrashic literature, and what very few do, he mastered all of Kabbalistic literature. He was an exceptional, extraordinary mystic and Kabbalist. How he fit it all into his mind is hard to know. He was ordained by some of the great rabbis of the time, including some of the greatest Lithuanian non-Hasidic rabbis of the time. Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik, Rabbi Chaim Brisker ordained him. Rabbi Chaim Meisel, the Rabbi of Lodz, Poland, ordained him. And other great luminaries, great sages of the time. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Schneerson was born in the year 1878. In the year he got married, he married Chana, and he lived by his in-laws. They lived in Nikolaev, Ukraine. His father-in-law, whose name was Rabbi Yanovsky, Meir Shlomo Yanovsky, was the rabbi of this fine and nice community in Nikolaev. And for the first decade or so of his son-in-law's life, he supported him, and his son-in-law just learned and wrote and learned, and had 3 little boys. The oldest was Menachem Mendel, who would later become the famous Lubavitcher Rebbe, and as I said, the middle brother was Beryl, who would be murdered, and the younger one was Label. All 3 very gifted kids, gifted children, great minds. In the year 1909, this is still under the Tsar, the city, the very famous large port city in southern Ukraine was known as Yekaterinoslav. It had a very big Jewish community, sizable, and it was considered a very important city in the Ukraine in terms of trade and business. It was a port city. And a vacancy was created because of its former rabbi died the year before in 1908, and they needed a new rabbi. At that time, the Jewish community experienced there was a lot of fractions, a lot of different groups. Because remember, this is the early 20th century where many isms were abducting and fighting and competing for the soul of Jewish youth. This is already the rumblings of revolution. It's still 1909, but the Tsar's position is tenuous. Tsar Nicholas II is not very popular. There's a lot of struggles in the Tsarist Russian Empire. There are volcanoes that are rumbling beneath the ground during those years. And the Jewish people have also been terribly demoralized. The anti-Semitism in Russia, the poverty, the deprivation, pogroms, persecution, and the suffering of so many centuries has finally left an imprint on the Jewish people, together with promises of all types of new isms that the Jews will be able to find utopia. So hundreds of thousands, millions of Jewish youth were lured in to various new isms and philosophies and perspectives that were quite alien from Judaism. And Yekaterinoslav was a very powerful symbol of different fractions, different philosophies, different groups competing for power. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Schneerson, later the father of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, was chosen at the end. He was nominated. He was a Chabad Chassid. He was very close disciple of the 5th Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Shalom Ber, who encouraged him very much to take on this position, understanding its pivotal importance and the power that this young, budding leader, sage, mystic, rabbi, scholar can bring and contribute to the Jewish community in Yekaterinoslav. And the fascinating thing was as follows. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Schneerson was a strong personality. He was also a holy man. He wasn't just a brilliant genius. He was a holy man. He was a true servant of God. He was what we call a tzaddik. He was really a righteous person. I heard from Rabbi Yoel Khan, who heard from his wife, the Rebbe's mother, that when her husband was exiled in Kazakhstan into some hick town, and he was given this tiny mosquito-infested apartment, there was no water, there was no food, the hygiene was unbearable, the circumstances were horrific. The poor man suffered terribly. And the whole environment was with pigs hanging out on the porch, and he had nothing. He had no people, he had no books, he had no community, he had no support, he had no freedom. And the food, there was no food. There was very little food. There was the war years. And she said, but once she managed to obtain water for him to wash his hands. For the mitzvah of washing hands, as Jews, we wash hands in the morning right when we wake up. And we wash hands before we eat bread, before we do hamotzi. And she said she once managed to obtain water for him to wash his hands in the morning when he woke up to remove the spiritual impurity and get ready for davening. And she told Rabbi YY, I heard it from him, she said, the joy of my husband to have some water, a little water to be able to pour in his hands, was more than the joy when I managed to find a few morsels of bread for him. Because he was really he was a sacred person. He was just one of these people for whom God is a reality in the most tangible sense, and a real manifestation and embodiment of Torah. And when he became the rabbi, ideologically he had a lot of enemies, but nonetheless, ultimately within the next few years, most Jews in the city came to love him. They may have loathed a lot of his opinions and his perspectives as a strong Torah observant Jew and a chassid, but in terms of his personality, they loved him because he was wise, he was kind, he was real, he was authentic. There was no politics, there was no corruption, there was no ego trip, there was no insecurity. He wasn't operating from a place of trauma, he was not a control freak. There were no agendas of money or power. They realized that he's a man of God, and they may have disagreed with him. They felt, he's representing an archaic religion. But nobody can help but love him and cherish his wife, because they were just exceptional human beings, both in terms of his scholarship, commitment, dedication, love to the people, and he really became a shepherd of his city, caring and trying to do whatever he can to help all Jews living in that city in everything, whether it was social issues, financial matters, community affairs, of course, religious affairs, familial affairs, education, all of the various Jewish social services that the city had. He became like the heartbeat of the city, the brain of the city. The Maimonides calls a Jewish king the heartbeat of the Jewish people. Somebody who has his finger on the pulse. And even though on his own he was really an exceptional scholar and mystic, but he applied himself to his vocation, and this became his focus. Of course, a few years later, the First World War breaks out. 1914, Tisha B'Av. The First World War breaks out, and within a few days, Russia is now engulfed in this, what was then called the Great War, later would be called the First World War. All Jews who were on the front, on the Eastern Front of the First World War, were exiled. The Tsar had a policy, there was no tolerance for any Jews living on the front. They were accused of espionage. It was horrible. And hundreds of Jewish communities who were living there for hundreds of years with an infrastructure were uprooted. Besides many Jews who were mobilized to the war and died and killed, but the exile, the disruption of Jewish life during the First World War was incredible, and a huge flood of immigrants came to southern Ukraine, to Yekaterinoslav, and it was the Lubavitcher Rebbe's parents, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak and his wife Chana, who were the ones who were most involved in making sure every one of them has a place to lodge, everyone has food, everyone has money, everybody has what to drink, everybody has a place for their children. And they gave them not just didn't only offer hospitality. It was an incredible moment. I once heard myself from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, he said, I have never seen my mother as a kid. The Rebbe was a youngster. The Lubavitcher Rebbe was born 1902. Just a few years after, 2 years, his parents got married, I think 1900, around 1900, and the Rebbe was born 2 years later, 1902. They named him Menachem Mendel because of the Tzemach Tzedek, his great-great-grandfather, and he grew up in little Nikolaev in the Ukraine. And he once testified, he said, in 1914, 15, I never saw my mother so passionate and so eager. She had no day and no night, all day. She became the chief architect of planning and implementing, saving all the Jews who immigrated there, who went into exile, who were refugees, escaping the front lines of the First World War, where they were accused of helping the enemy, of helping the Germans. Soon, as we all know, Vladimir Lenin and the Reds stage a revolution, the famous or infamous Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak and his wife lived in a very sizable, nice apartment as the rabbi and the rebbetzin of the city. But of course, after the communist revolution, everything changes. Their apartment is cut into two, and the city's name is changed because it can't be named anymore after Catherine the Great, Yekaterinoslav. Tsarist history is now wiped out and deleted from Russia. It becomes Dnepropetrovsk. And fascinatingly, and this is one of the saddest chapters, not only in Russian history and in Russian Jewish history, but in all of Jewish history, and I should tell you, very unknown. One of the groups that joins the Communist Party and becomes really a part of the Communist Party is called the Yevsektia. And the Yevsektia is basically the section of the Communist Party that is dedicated to Jewish affairs, and it's run by Jews. Lenin himself, there was somewhere in his lineage, there were some Jews there. Joseph Stalin was a Georgian, brilliant, paranoid, evil murderer, like Lenin was. Trotsky, Leon Trotsky, his name was Leibel Bronstein. He was a Jewish kid, and he became ultimately the leader of the Red Army, which brought the whole country under the tyranny of Trotsky's terror, together with Lenin and Stalin. Of course, in 1924, Lenin would die, and Joseph Stalin would take over the reins of the Soviet Union, the USSR, and he would reign with a brutal and iron fist for the next 30 years until Stalin's death in March 1953, around Purim time 1953. Stalin and Trotsky, of course, would have to separate ways. The Trotskyites were not the Stalinites, and a major war would break out between Stalin and Trotsky. Trotsky would have to go into exile, and ultimately he would be axed by Stalin's agents in August 1940. The Jewish Trotsky would be axed to death. What is unknown is the role of the Yevsektia in the absolute destruction and disintegration of Russian Jewry. People blame Stalin, and he is the right person to blame, because Stalin was one of the most evil men who ever lived. He murdered between 20 and 50 million people of his own people. That a person should in 30 years murder between 20 and 50 million of his own people is unfathomable. We can't even understand it. He murdered more people than Adolf Hitler murdered. And the Jews were a major target, because any religious person, and all religions were targets, plus of his own Jewish hatred and anti-Semitism. But what Stalin did was something else. The Yevsektia was a special party among the Communist Party of Jews. And most of them had a Jewish education as children. And they rose to the top. The leader of the Yevsektia was a man named Shimon Dimnenstein. And they, through their operators, went to every Jewish town, village, city, and province in the entire Soviet Union. And within 10 years, they destroyed Judaism in a way that it could not be destroyed over the last 200 years. Now, over the last 200 years, Judaism in Eastern Europe was challenged very heavily by the movements known as the Haskalah movements, the movement of the Enlightenment, which began, of course, in France and England and Germany, and then traveled east, and ultimately caused many, many Jews to stray away from Jewish heritage, from Jewish tradition, from Jewish faith. But nothing came close to what the Yevsektia did in 10 years, from 1920 till 1929, when Stalin got rid of the Yevsektia. They were not good, they were not loyal enough, and he felt he doesn't need them anymore. It's unbelievable, tragic, what Jews did to their own brothers and sisters. Not in 100 years, in 10 years. They managed to go from city to city and sow terror, fear, and dread into every Jewish community. They forced most rabbis, teachers, educators, religious leaders, moyals, shachtim, anyone involved in public Jewish life, underground. Most of them either escaped Russia or completely understood that you have to seize most activities connected to Judaism. Most Jewish life in Russia within those 10 years was obliterated, destroyed, decimated. The way they did this was sadly brilliant, strategic. Tonight is not the night to discuss the tragedy and the strategies of the Yevsektia. One of their greatest targets was, of course, Chabad Lubavitch. Chabad Lubavitch was living in Russia already since the days of the Baal HaTanya. The founder of Chabad grew up in Belarus. He was born in Lineage, in White Russia. Today it's the area of Belarus. Rabbi Zalman of Liadi was born in 1745. Of course, the Baal Shem Tov lived in Ukraine. He was the founder of the Hasidic movement. But the first Chabad Rebbe, Rabbi Zalman, and they were called Schneersons. The Rebbe's father was Schneerson because they come from Schneer. He was born in Belarus. He lived there his whole life. Liozhne, Vitebsk, Liadi. Napoleon declared war on Russia in 1812. He ran away to the Ukraine and he died in the Poltava Gubernia and buried in Hadych. He passed away in a place called Piena, and then he was buried in Hadych. This is the first Rebbe of Chabad. So they had a presence in Russia already since the early 1700s. And now, in the early 1900s, in the 1920s, the Yevsektia targeted Chabad Lubavitch. One of the sole big leaders and teachers to remain in the Soviet Union and continue to battle the communists was the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Yitzchak Schneerson, who was born in 1880, passed away in 1950 in New York, and his father died in 1920. The fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe took over in 1920, and he built, Rabbi Shalom Ber Levin, the main librarian of Lubavitch, told me that the Lubavitcher Rebbe built 600 underground Jewish schools in Russia. 600. Some of them lasted for a few days, a few weeks, a few months. Some of them were maintained. But everything had to go underground, and he was maybe the only one, or one of the handful of Jewish leaders who could remain there and fight until they arrested him. They sentenced him to death in 1927. Through major diplomatic pressure and involvement of the Joint and American political power, and a great miracle, the Rebbe was saved. His sentence was commuted to 10 years in the Gulag, in exile, and then to 3 years, and then to a few days, and the Rebbe was liberated in 1927, and he left Russia at the end of 1927. At that point, the persecution became so heavy. The Yevsektia was so successful. People were arrested, tortured, died. The fear and dread was so powerful. They managed to separate families, communities. If you were a child and you were informed on your father or mother or grandfather, you were promoted in the Communist Party. So what they did was they split up families. There was no trust anymore. The whole fabric of community, of family, of civilization was destroyed in the Soviet Union. And I would say, who remained the rock of Ukraine? The Rabbi of Dnepropetrovsk, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Schneerson. Like the Schneerson tradition, he remained untouchable and unbreakable. His confidence, his faith, his resilience, and his fortitude is an incredible, heroic chapter in Jewish history. He remained a steadfast shepherd of his people. And even though he knew how dangerous it is, it's a fascinating thing. You will not find, not that I know, you will not find many rabbis who survived as long as he did. He remained the Rabbi of Dnepropetrovsk till 1939. Most rabbis already in the 20s had to go underground or leave Russia, including some of the greats, the Chafetz Chaim, Reb Moshe Feinstein, of blessed memory. They all had to leave Russia. It was impossible. You had great people, Reb Chatzkel Abramsky, Reb Shlomo Yosef Zevin, a lot of great rabbis and sages. It was just impossible. Either they were arrested, exiled to the Gulag, shot, or scared to death and remained quiet, or just left. But Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Schneerson remains a rabbi. Some say that he was so beloved by the Jews, including the communists, that they protected him. That despite all the turmoil, on an individual level, even though they disagreed with him, and they loathed everything he stood for, but they loved him as a person. We saw the same thing with his son, the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Many people ideologically disagreed with him, but if you met him, it was very hard not to like him, not to fall in love with him, because these people didn't have a mean bone in his body. I remember the Rebbe very well. He was very emphatic. He was very idealistic. He was sometimes very sharp, but it was never personal, ever. It was never an ego issue. It was never an insecurity. It was never, I can't speak to you. There was never an axe to grind. It was pure. There was something so pure about it. So even if you opposed him ideologically, you felt that there was no mean bone in the body, that he really cares and he'll do you any favor you need, because it's completely not personal. It was very fascinating. The Rebbe taught, I think, so many people how to disagree without being disagreeable. And I think he learned that from his father. His mother. His mother was a very, very warm person. His father was very idealistic. He was a true man of faith and God, and one of the great giants of Torah in his generation. But he cared for people, and he loved people, and he was sensitive, and he was understanding. And they saw that it's for real, and there was such wisdom there. The depth of Jewish history, of Jewish psychology, of Jewish philosophy, Jewish scholarship, of the Talmud, of Halacha, of Jewish spirituality, and it was synthesized in his mind. This man, therefore, had and inspired tremendous love from the people, and I think that's one of the main reasons he lasted till 1939. In fact, there was a story I heard myself from the Lubavitcher Rebbe when I was a child. There was a children's rally on Pesach. His father was born Cholamoet Pesach, the 18th of Nisan. So there was once the children were gathered on Pesach in 770, and the Rebbe spoke to us, and he shared a story about his father. He says, my father's birthday, I want to share a story. As I told you, his father was born in 1878. And he said that one year, his father, most of the wheat comes from Ukraine. Ukraine was an incredible resource for grain. Of course, Stalin destroyed that with the famous hunger that he managed to introduce in Ukraine, probably the first time in history that a leader of a country should cause more than 5 million people, of his own people, to die from hunger despite the fact that they had food that they grew, their crops in their fields. Another horrible tragedy of the former Soviet Union that's also unknown. And with the help of Jews, it's just tragic beyond tragedy what happened in the Soviet Union. So, and Rabbi Yitzchak Schneerson, he was the Rabbi of Dnepropetrovsk. He was the one who gave the kosher certification, the kosher certified label for all the matzahs. He came to see what's happening in the matzah bakeries, and he saw that it wasn't real. The communists, everything was a lie. Propaganda, propaganda, propaganda. Like my father used to say, my father grew up in communist Russia, so he knew very well what the communists were like, and his own father was arrested during the purges of 1938 and also sent to the Gulag. So I grew up in a home where there was no, let's put it this way, there was no superfluous love to the commies, okay? And my mother also grew up in communist Russia. May she be well. She grew up in Georgia. Now Stalin left the Georgians a little. The Georgians, they were left alone a little bit, maybe because he was a Georgian. But they also suffered terribly. But it wasn't like the Jews of Russia or the Jews of Ukraine. In any case, so Rabbi Yitzchak Schneerson saw that the matzah is propaganda. And the communists were always into this idea, we don't disturb anybody, we're not against religion. Officially in the constitution of the communists, you're allowed to practice religion. And that's why the Yevsektia was so powerful, because a lot of times, I don't know if you know this, the Jews would sometimes make a trial between the Yevsektia and the leadership of the Soviet Union. The Yevsektia would take away all the shuls. What was the excuse? The excuse was they needed for cultural events in order to raise a new generation of Jews who are part of the workmen's circle and the workmen's groups, and they're not infected and poisoned by the horrors of religion. So they would take away the shuls with excuses. And the Jews would sometimes go to the leadership of the communists and say, you said we're allowed to practice religion. And there were a few instances where the Yevsektia actually lost. That's another piece of history. But in any case, it was all lies. And Rabbi Yitzchak Schneerson, they wanted to force him to sign off on the matzahs, because this would prove that the Jews are getting what they need, and everything is just, and everything is fine. And it was an important source of income as well, because Jews ate matzahs. And Rabbi Yitzchak Schneerson, in a unique act of heroic courage, said, no, as long as it's not all under his supervision and he can monitor everything, he and his people, he will not sign. The pressure was so fierce, he went to meet the president of the Soviet Union, President Kalinin, and he spoke to him as a Jew, and he said, I cannot sign on these matzahs, and I will come out and I will tell everybody that they're not kosher matzahs. Because let's say they're bringing grain over and then there was a leak in the wagon and it all got wet. It's not matzah anymore, it's chametz. All these types of things, you have to monitor everything, it's very serious. Kalinin agreed, and he said that Rabbi Schneerson, Rabbi Yitzchak Schneerson, is the one who's completely in charge, and he got sanctioned in those years, the 1930s, that there be all the matzahs under his jurisdiction. It's just an amazing thing how he stood so steadfast with such dignity. And they say that over the years there were a lot of summons for arrests, but somehow those nights he was warned by friends of the Communist Party to leave the house, to leave the city. And until 1939, he remained the rabbi despite tremendous persecutions and problems non-stop. But he did whatever he can together with his wife, Chana. In 1929, Stalin decided that he doesn't need the Yevsektia anymore. Doesn't need them, mission was accomplished, and that's when he demolished the Yevsektia, and it was over, but the damage was already done. Jewish life in the Soviet Union was mamish at the verge of destruction. There were those few individuals that kept it alive and kept it alive underground. And one of the greatest who remained there till the late 30s was Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Schneerson. Of course, during the purges of 1938-39, Stalin decided that all of these Jewish communists from the former Yevsektia were not loyal enough, even though they threw their fathers under the bus, their mothers under the bus. Thousands of years of Jewish history they threw under the bus. And they did everything they can to obliterate the last vestige of Judaism. For Joseph Stalin, their loyalty was still a matter of doubt, and most of them were shot or tortured or sent to the Gulag, where most of them did not survive, including the leader of the Yevsektia, who was murdered. And most of the greatest Jewish communist leaders were either murdered during the purges or later in the 1940s and wiped out. Those very individuals who dedicated their lives to the Communist Party and denied that they were Jewish, nothing Jewish about them. They're part of the socialist revolution to unite the whole world. Workers of the whole world unite with Karl Marx's manifesto, inspired by Lenin, etc. Those who denied any connection to the Jewish people were ultimately accused of being dirty, filthy, disloyal Jews, fascists, Zionists, nationalists, religious people who are undermining the communist vision, and they all had to be shot. Which, by the way, is an incredible, incredible lesson in history. When Jews start hating themselves and loathing themselves and thinking that by not being Jewish and by assimilating and by denying our history, our heritage, our faith, we're going to appease the anti-Semites and they'll ultimately accept us. We'll change our noses, we'll do some plastic surgery, we'll make believe we're completely Gentile, and then we're Gentiles, and then they'll finally accept us. This is one of the great sad delusions and illusions of Jews throughout history. It never worked. It's never going to work. A Jew is a Jew is a Jew. And the story of Soviet history is an incredible, incredible testimony of it. In the early 20s, Menachem Mendel, the young Menachem Mendel, met his fiancée, the daughter of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who was living then in Leningrad. And when the Rebbe left Russia in 1927, the end of 27, he managed to take out his future son-in-law from the Soviet Union. They moved to Latvia, and the young Menachem Mendel Schneerson shortly after moved to Berlin, where he began to study in various universities in Berlin. He would get married in Warsaw, and for the next decade he would live in Berlin. When Hitler comes to power, he would move to Paris. Ultimately, in 1941, after Hitler invades France, the young Menachem Mendel and his wife Chaya Mushka will manage to get out from Lisbon, and they would take a boat and arrive in the United States in June 41. In 1950, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the sixth Lubavitcher, would pass away, and Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson would succeed him as the seventh Lubavitcher Rebbe, who over the next decades would transform the Jewish world. His father and mother remained behind. And even when he got married in 1928 in Warsaw, they would not give him permission to leave the Soviet Union. And it was a sad day for the Rebbe and his wife. He couldn't be at his own wedding with his parents. After all the attempts, they could not make it. There was an incredible telegram that the Lubavitcher Rebbe's father wrote to him from Ukraine to Warsaw. When I read it the first time, I was pretty young, I was a teenager, and I couldn't help but crying. He writes, you see the love that he has. He says, how I'm with you, with every fiber of my being. He tells him what to think under the chuppah. He tells him what to meditate about under the chuppah. How he blesses him and his new bride. He blesses them with family, with a large family, with children. Of course, they would never have children. And the Rebbe Tzimchana, the Rebbe's mother, wrote in her diary how the tablecloth on which her husband wrote this telegram, it was soaked as though it was submerged in water from the tears of her husband. And in fact, they made what people call a mock wedding, but they made a wedding in their home in Ukraine to celebrate the marriage of their son. And they invited only a few people. They thought some close people will come. Hundreds of people came, and they danced the whole night. It was one of the great moments. And remember, there was curfew. This is communist Russia, 1928. These were terrible, terrible times. But the joy was just uninhibited. And after that, there's a correspondence from Lubavitcher Rebbe's father to the Rebbe, from Ukraine to Berlin or to Paris, till 1939, when the dark arrest has arrived. And you know what's interesting? Rabbi Yitzchak Schneerson wrote his whole life. He was a prolific writer, a genius. He had a unique style of learning, which I should mention. There are two parts of Judaism, the esoteric and the exoteric, the revealed and the hidden, the legal, concrete, and the mystical, transcendent, metaphysical. Usually there are two streams of Judaism. Not for this man. For him, there was a synthesis. He had a bird's eye view of Judaism. He can discuss a chapter in any part of the Talmud and analyze every word of it. Every story, every personality is reflective of certain spiritual truths, and his son inherited that style, that holistic style of seeing the whole Torah as integrated, and every detail and every nuance is a reflection of the DNA of Judaism, literally like the cells in the body, where every single cell has its own unique, indispensable contribution, and it has a copy, a double copy of the jinnah with the blueprint of the whole organism. That's how Rabbi Levi Yitzchak saw every little detail. A name in a story, the name of a city, the age of the person. Incredible scholarship. And he wrote for years. Then came the dark day. It was a few days before Passover, 1939. These are the days of Stalin's purges, where hundreds of thousands, millions were arrested, shot, tortured, sent to the Gulag. Devastating times. And at last, the Rabbi of Dnepropetrovsk, the great hero, the great teacher, the great leader, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Schneerson, is arrested. His wife doesn't know. His wife doesn't know where he is. He's taken away. They only let him take a few things. They schlep him away. Last year, a big delegation, it was 75th Yartzeit, so a lot of Hasidim went to Kazakhstan, to his gravesite, to pray there, to pray to Hashem there. And one of the people who went there was a man named Reb Mottel Garari. Mottel Garari just died right before Pesach from Corona, during the pandemic. He was, I think, 82, a very special man. His story is unique. His father was a college student, Mark Garari, Mordechai, who lived in Dnepropetrovsk. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Schneerson made him a Baal Tshuva. He brought him back to Judaism. He got married, and one Friday afternoon, he went to the sea, the Black Sea, and he went to bathe. To the mikveh before Shabbos. There was an undercurrent. He drowned. His wife was pregnant. She gave birth to Mottel Garari, who was named after his father. And I knew him. He just died from Corona. And he said last year when he went to Kazakhstan, he said that he heard from a Jew that when they took away the Lubavitcher Rebbe's father to the Gulag, to prison, he saw Jews. And he turned to them and he said, a Jew does not say goodbye without words of Torah. Al yipoter adam mechaver le'metachvar halacha. And he said, the first letter of the whole Torah is Lamed. The last letter of the whole, first letter of the whole Torah is Beis, Bereshis. The last letter of the whole Torah is Lamed. Together it makes up Lev, a heart. Lamed at the end, Beis in the beginning. And then he spoke about the fact that the letter before Beis is Aleph. The letter after Beis is Gimel. The letter before Lamed is Chaf. The letter after Lamed is Mem. So it makes up Ach and Gam. And he explained in the Talmud what Ach means. Ach means to diminish. Ach miyutuhu, and Gam is to increase. And he said there are Jews who spiritually are very small, they're not knowledgeable, they're not very involved. And then there are Jews who are giants, they're great scholars. And he says, Echad hamarbe v'echad hamamit. Whether you're Ach or a Gam, ubelvachi echaven liboy, the most important thing is the heart. The beginning and the end of Torah is about the heart. He says, I don't care how brilliant you are or how simple you are, the most important thing is to care, the heart, to be a heart. And those were the words he left the Jews. He said, I don't want you to lose your heart, don't lose your passion, don't lose your commitment, don't lose your emotions. And indeed, he was a heart. Just a little tidbit of history is so telling. And I guess his son learned from this. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, many Jews, they could not stay home. They felt by the communists, if you didn't show up to work, you could lose your job. If you didn't have a job, you couldn't get bread. It was crazy. The persecutions were terrible. To be a Jew and live like a Jew was very, very difficult. It was literally an act of daily self-sacrifice. So Jews couldn't always withstand the test, and they went to work on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. What did the rabbi of the city do? He would make an early pre-sunrise minyan. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur in the morning, very, very early before that to go to work, so they should come, and by sunrise they should be able to hear the shofar and do a fast prayer and go to work on Rosh Hashanah. Now some rabbis might say, they're desecrating Rosh Hashanah, they're going to work, I should make a minyan for them. But he didn't think that way. Of course, he wanted they should be there Rosh Hashanah all day and they shouldn't go to work. But this is how a real leader of the Jewish people thinks. A great leader, it's like a brain or a heart. The heart can be concerned only with the brain or the heart. The circulatory system has to reach every single cell in the body and give it the oxygen and the nutrients it needs. And when there's a clot, it affects the entire body. The same is true with a brain. Jewish leaders are called the hearts and the brains. A brain can't be concerned only with the kidneys or the liver or the heart or the pancreas or the lungs or other vital organs. No, the brain is concerned with the smallest toenail and the pinky and every strand of hair. The brain is the central nervous system that is connected to every fiber of your being, every cell, every artery, every sinew, every tissue, every bone, every limb, every organ. If you're a real brain, every part of the body is your responsibility. How do you know who is a brain of the Jewish people? When you see those Jewish leaders, nobody is excluded. There's no, this person is not my type. This person is too low for me. That concept doesn't work for the brain. If I'm a brain, you're part of my world. If you're part of the living organism of the Jewish people, you're part of my world. That characterizes Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Schneerson, and it set an example for how his son led the Chabad movement and ultimately changed the face of the Jewish world with this spirit, with this enthusiasm. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Schneerson is taken to prison a few days before Pesach. His wife doesn't know where she is. He's there for months. He's suffering terribly. She finally finds out he was taken to Kiev in Ukraine. She sends him some packages. They set up a trial date. You know the trials in communist Russia, one big farce and fake and lie and deception. And they exile him. He's sentenced 5 years in exile for his counter-revolutionary work against the Russian government, the communist regime, the Communist Party. And he's sent to Kazakhstan, far, far away, far east, place called Chile in Kazakhstan. A little city, no Jews, no community. Horrible living conditions, horrible. They don't allow him to take too many things. He was a strong man. He was a respectable man. He was physically strong, tall, handsome, very good looking, attractive, appealing, and a very colorful personality. But over the next years, he is broken on every level. Emotionally, he's not broken. His wife, Chana, does something that is incredible. She decides to leave her comfortable, relatively speaking, her comfortable home, her city. She was a Rebbetzin, and she follows him. She did not have to, but voluntarily she follows him. She wants to be there for her husband. Their children at this point are not here anymore. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, Menachem Mendel, is living in Europe. The other son is living in Europe. Beryl he was not well. He was in a hospital. And what happened was she follows her husband. She realizes how dire it is, but she can take a few books. She takes a few precious books. He's so happy to get these books. He could learn some Torah. And she remains at his side. He wants to teach. He was a teacher. He was a brilliant teacher. There's nobody to teach to. There's a few pigs that hang out in his courtyard and a neighbor who was very, very antagonistic. And you know what she does? I heard this also from the Rebbe himself. He was very moved by what his mother did. She went and she found the proper herbs and she harvested the herbs and she grinded them and she developed them into ink and she brought them to her husband. And on the margins of all the books that he had, he wrote. Every single page, the margins are full and you see different colors of ink, red and green and blue and black, because this was literally handmade by his wife. She manufactured ink over there in Kazakhstan. She brought it. Whatever she can do to help her husband, she did. Of course, there was no Jews, there was no minyan, there was no Jewish community, there was barely any food. But he didn't stop writing. He wrote and wrote and wrote. She describes how Simchas Torah, they were in this little tiny mosquito-infested room. And he picked up a Mishnayos. a Mishnah, and he danced all night. He was a real man of God. He just danced all night with this book, the Mishnah and the Tanya and the Zohar. He took the Mishnah and he was just dancing in circles. And he had this famous song that they used to sing in his shul every Simchas Torah. And they called it Rebbe Leivik's song because it was like his Simchas Torah song. They say that it comes from the Alter Rebbe. They sang it in his shul. And in fact, for many, many years, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, at a moment of joy, would start this song. And whenever he wanted his father's song to be sung, everybody knew this is the song. And the song went like this. Ay, 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 did it, ay, 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 da-dam. Ay, 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 did it, ay, 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 da-dam. Da-da-da, ya-da-da, ya-da-da, ya-yam, da-da-da-la-lam, da-da-yo-yina, ya-ya-yap, da-da-da-la-la-la-lam. Oh, yida, ya, ya, yap, da-da-da-la-la-la-lam, da-da-da-la-la-la-la, da-da-da-la-la-la-lam. Ah, ya baba, ya baba, bam. Hey, ya baba, baba, bye. Oh, ya baba, ya baba, bye. Hey, ya baba, ya baba, oh, ya baba, ya baba, bye. Ya, ya, bye, bye, bam. Da 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 la 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 lam. Oh, ya da ya yam. Da 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 la 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 la, la da la 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 la, la 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 la, da 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 da. And as when I grew up during the Hakafos on Simchas Torah in 770, his son, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, would stand with a Sefer Torah. And there were 10,000 people in the room, and he would dance, and he would start this song of his father that his father sang back in the Ukraine in the darkest days and in exile in the darkest days. But now it was 10,000 people dancing with the Rebbe. And there was one stanza that he would make with his hand. They should repeat it again and again, sometimes 10 times. One part of that song. Ah, ya baba, ya baba, bam. Hey, ya baba, baba, ba, yo. Ya baba, ya baba, ba. Hey, ya baba, baba, ba. Ya baba, baba, bam. Hey, ya baba, ya da da ya. Ya baba, again and again and again and again. And the electricity was powerful, incredibly potent and inspiring. But in Kazakhstan, he was himself with a Mishnah dancing. The only other person was his wife. Emotionally, he remained powerful and strong, but physically he succumbed. And in 1944, in the middle of the Second World War, they finally granted permission for him to move to a place called Alma-Ata, where there was a Jewish community, there was a synagogue, there was a Jewish cemetery, there was some Jewish life. He moved there in the middle of 1944, but he was already very ill, extremely ill. There's a picture taken from him during that period of his life, and when they brought it to his son, he wrote on it, "Is this my father?" Because you can't recognize him. You can't recognize him. And a few months later, he passed away in August 1944, middle of the war. It was obviously a very tragic loss, not only for his wife and the community, but there was really no family. And he was buried in Alma-Ata, where he is interred to this very day in Kazakhstan. It's far, far, far away. Remember, it's far from the main city, which was Moscow, Petersburg. But that's where he was buried. That's where he was in exile. His son, one of them was already shot, although the parents didn't know, because they were in Kazakhstan. The Germans didn't reach them, so they were saved from the Germans. Because Dnepropetrovsk was Ukraine. Ukraine was wiped out. Much of Ukraine was wiped out by the Germans. I assume if he would have been in Yekaterinoslav, Dnepropetrovsk, he and his wife, I'm not sure they would survive. Who knows? But here they were actually saved from the Germans, but he died from this terrible persecution and illness. He was really crushed. He was in his, how old was he? He was 66 years old. And they buried him over there, a modest funeral. As I said, the 20th of 1944. One son was already dead, was murdered. The Rebbe was living at the time in New York. He was saved from the Nazis, and he hasn't seen his father since he left in 1927. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe left in 27, and his father passed away in 44. He never saw his father again. His mother ultimately left Alma-Ata. She went to visit her home but there was nothing there. Jews were wiped out. Her own mother was murdered. Her family was murdered. Whoever, the Jews of Ukraine were murdered. So most of their families were gone. And ultimately, she made it to Moscow. And then, with forged passports, she made it out of the Soviet Union, like many Jews did after the war in 1946. She came to Paris. And her son, Rabbi Menachem Mendel, flew from New York to Paris to welcome his mother. He hasn't seen his mother in 20 years, since 27. It was a very emotional reunion. He remained with her in Paris for 3 months. He brought her back to New York. And she lived as a widow in New York, a few blocks away from her son. 3 years later, he would become the Rebbe. And she remained there for the next 15 years, the last 15 years of his life. And every single day, 5 o'clock, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, as busy as he was, would leave everything. He would leave his office. Everybody knew he's walking up Kingston Avenue. He would go visit his mother. Sun and rain and sunshine, stormy day and a calm day, summer, winter, every day. In the afternoon, the Lubavitcher Rebbe would leave go of everything and he would go visit his mother. You learned what respect for a mother is. Of course, on Shabbos and on Yom Tov, he visited her until she passed away a few days before Yom Kippur, 1964. And she's buried already in Queens, in Montefiore, actually just a few feet away from where her son would later be interred, the Rebbe, in 1994. A fascinating vignette that they say, the Rebbe as a little kid, there's a beautiful picture of him as a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old. Very, very adorable picture, very cute picture. He's really dressed in this really nice outfit, very impressive. It's a cute picture. Rabbi Brook can show it to you. And they say that his mother once took her son, the young Menachem Mendel, to the Black Sea. It was a hot August day. It was boiling. And the Rebbe, this little kid, had this big yarmulke on him, this big kappel, big kippah, like a real big one. And he was sweating buckets. It was so hot. So this Jew who was, a little enlightened and cynical walks by and says, "Jewish kid, get rid of this thing from your head. Get rid of your sweating. You need some air. You need some freedom." So this little kid, Menachem Mendel, says, I'm not allowed to. It's my yarmulke. So this Jew says, you know what? I'm taking this sin on me. It's on me, it's not on you. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe, as a little boy, told him 2 words, L'may nafka mina. Who cares if the sin is on you or the sin is on me? Sometimes 2 words, butz and captures the story of a person. It's not about me or you. So the sin will be on you. That's not going to make me feel better. If it's not the right thing, it's not the right thing. Who cares who does it? In fact, during the terrible pogroms during the early 1900s, young Lubavitcher Rebbe, as a 15-year-old, organized a little Jewish, people don't know this, a little Jewish platoon, an army in Dnepropetrovsk literally to protect themselves from the pogromists. At last, I want to leave you with this. If I would have been a fly on the wall in 1939 when they arrested Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Schneerson, I would say to you, he tried, he battled, but it was in vain. Ultimately, you can't fight City Hall, and in that case it wasn't City Hall. It was hundreds of millions of people under the superpower of the Soviet Union. He was arrested. If I would be a fly on the wall in Chile, Kazakhstan, I would look at the depraved circumstances, at the horrific conditions, at the lack of the most basic freedoms and necessities that a human being has. And my heart would go out to a rabbi who was so dedicated, who believed so much in God, but whose life mission ultimately failed miserably. And all that came out of all of his work and sacrifice was years in a forlorn, isolated cocoon, far from civilization, far from any semblance of normalcy, dignity, and any Jewish life or community. And if I would observe his death in August 1944, I would say it's the sad end of a life of a person who was rich in content and rich in dedication, but ultimately died under very difficult circumstances and sad circumstances, like millions died in 1944. And that would have been my conclusion, Judaism in Ukraine and the rest of the Soviet Union had no hope. But flies on the wall don't always have the whole perspective. All the writings that he wrote for years and years and years were all confiscated. When they arrested him in 1939, they confiscated a lot of the writings. The other writings got lost. We still don't know what happened to them. Are they around? Are they not around? Will they be discovered? Who knows? You know which writings we have from him? Those that he wrote in Kazakhstan with the ink that was manufactured by his wife. Those are the only real writings that we have from him. And the letters that he sent to Europe to his son studying in Berlin and Paris. Now the mother is scared to smuggle them out because if she's caught with these writings, it can be horrible and dangerous. So she leaves them in Russia. And ultimately, it's in the late 50s and the 60s that through the diplomatic relations that Israel had with Russia, the Lubavitcher Rebbe managed to get those manuscripts out of the Soviet Union. They arrived to him in the 60s, and in the early 70s, he published them. 5 beautiful, incredible books of his father. Most of the writings of his father he never got. But those writings in Kazakhstan somehow remained. And they arrived to his son and he published them all in their study till today. They're incredibly deep and powerful. Plus the 66 letters that he wrote to his son during the 30s, that also survived because those letters arrived to Europe. And they were printed, and this remains the legacy of his writings. And something very moving happened. Every Shabbos, as the Lubavitcher Rebbe would speak to the crowd, he would have the book of his father, one of the books on the table. I remember there was a Jew, Rabbi Chaim would bring it down, and the Rebbe would open it up or look at it, and he would study with the whole audience, thousands of people, a piece of his father's teachings, and he would explain it and apply it and elucidate on it every Shabbos for decades. This was such a display of respect, where his father's legacy and ideas and scholarship remained immortalized. After his mother's death, in her memory, he studied every Shabbos a Rashi of the Parsha in her memory, also for 25 years, explaining and really developing a whole method of how to learn Rashi. So every Shabbos we knew there was a special talk that was dedicated in tribute to his father and a special talk dedicated in tribute to his mother. Talk about respecting your tati and mami. But then something else happens. In 1989, Mr. Gorbachev, tear the wall down. The Berlin Wall falls. Communism crumbles. And suddenly, for the first time in more than 7 decades, Jews are given permission to start living a Jewish life in the open. But is there anything left? The communists did too of a good job. But that was not the case. For 70 years, students and disciples of Rabbi Yitzchak Schneerson in Ukraine, students and disciples of the Lubavitcher Rebbe all over the Soviet Union maintained an underground network of Judaism that did not cease for one day. And in 1989, it all sprung up from the subterranean chambers. It all sprung up. And the next few years, the Lubavitcher Rebbe started to send dozens and dozens and dozens of ambassadors who began to rebuild Judaism in the Soviet Union. If you go back today to the Soviet Union, you will observe with your eyes one of the greatest miracles of Jewish history. And I'm not saying this with drama and fanfare and exaggeration. You go back to Russia today, you're looking for a miracle, one of the greatest miracles. And go back to the city where the Lubavitcher Rebbe's father was the rabbi, Dnepropetrovsk. And you'll see what my cousin, Rabbi Shmuel and Chani Kamenetsky, they're first cousins of mine, with the help of the other Chabad ambassadors and the Jews living there, built over the last years, since 1990 till today, that we're talking about, what are we talking about? Tav Shinun, Samach Ayin Pei, 30 years. The vibe, the enthusiasm, the unity, I think it's one of the most beautiful centers of Judaism in the whole world from a physical, aesthetical point of view. The Menorah Center in Dnepropetrovsk. Something to behold with your eyes. To be able to come back today and see that is so moving because it tells you that there's another element to history. If you would have been there in 39, you would have said it's all lost. But you come back 70, 80 years later and you see not only is it not lost, but everything that the rabbi of Dnepropetrovsk, the Rebbe of Dnepropetrovsk, fought for, taught, is there. It's timeless, it's eternal, it's powerful. Where's Stalin? Where's Lenin? Where's Trotsky? Where's Karl Marx? Where's Kaganovich? Where's Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Andropov? Where are they? Where's the Politburo? Where's the Sektia? They're gone. They're in Wikipedia. Where's Rabbi Yitzchak Schneerson? Where is he? Where's Torah? Where's mitzvahs? Where's Yiddishkeit? And the answer is, wherever you go to Russia, you'll see Judaism is alive. Torah is vibrant. The study of Torah, the celebration of mitzvahs, Jewish education, Jewish schools, even amidst the pandemic of coronavirus. Lag BaOmer, a parade, 3,000 Jewish kids marching in the streets of Moscow, screaming Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Hanukkah menorah lit in the Kremlin, a few feet from where the corpses of Stalin and Lenin lay. I want to say I feel bad for them that they're turning over in their grave, but it's not a grave, it's a mausoleum. I want to say I feel bad for them, but I don't really feel bad for them. Hundreds of thousands of Jewish children receiving an education, summer camps, social programs, nursing homes, homes of assisted living, all types of Jewish educational programs. Not long ago, the Chabad ambassador to Bidabijan, where Stalin wanted to exile 3 million Soviet Jews. Bidabijan, 5,000 miles from Moscow, opened a glatt kosher restaurant. Take your wife there on a honeymoon. From Boseman, go to Bidabijan. And I have a cousin in Western Siberia is finishing now a mikveh. If you want to donate, you can donate. He's looking for his last funds, finishing a mikveh. Women had to travel 7 hours to find a mikveh. Western Siberia. So the question is, who won? Stalin or Schneerson? The 76th Yartzeit of the great father of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Schneerson of blessed memory, is a time to pick up our glasses and make a toast to this special, special hero, to this special man, to his wife, to his family, to his disciples, to his children, to his great son, the Rebbe, and really to all of the Rebbe's ambassadors and Chassidim the world over, who took an example of this extraordinary individual, whose Yartzeit we commemorate today, who never allowed short-term obstacles and the vicissitudes and challenges and fluctuations of life, and even the terrible persecutions, to blur his vision, to stifle his enthusiasm, to crush his creativity, and to dampen his faith. And today, we could see that everything he fought for is alive and well. It's growing from day to day. And if you need a living example for this, go to Boseman, Montana, or go to any other part of Montana, and you'll see the work of the ambassadors of the Rebbe, who was inspired by his father, and inspired, of course, by his Rebbe, to be able to create and to continue this revolution on a daily basis, to know that evil is powerful, it may prosper, but it's never eternal. And ultimately, goodness, kindness, morality, ethics, the power of Torah, mitzvahs, Yiddishkeit, godliness, lives forever. Thank you very much. L'chaim.
Hi, Rabbi.
Hi.
Letters from in Kazakhstan. What language were they written in?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
The letters that are left from Kazakhstan.
Oh, he wrote in Hebrew. He wrote in Hebrew.
In Hebrew?
Yeah.
Okay.
He was writing it on the books that he had. His wife was allowed to take a few books for him. So every margin is filled. It's a dramatic piece of history. You see a man who had nothing, but every inch, every centimeter on the page is filled with his writings and insights. Another incredible thing is you see what's called a memory. In Kazakhstan, there was no Google in 1944. Realize that. Even in New York, there was no Google. But here was a man without any books. Everything is from memory. And his mastery of the literature of Judaism and of Kabbalah and of the Talmud is magical. Right here, I have my mouse on it. You see how he writes? This is upside down, this is on the side. And sometimes there's different colors here. You'll have red, green, brown, blue. It's all his wife manufactured. Her name was Chana. And imagine now deciphering this and putting it into a book, and that's what they did in the late 60s and the early 70s, and today they were all published.
Watching you throughout April, your inspiration. You're really incredible, and I appreciate all the good work you're doing. And I understand you said a good word about my late sister's Lucky Esteban on the Torah. So I thank you for that as well. And it's good seeing you, and you got to come out to Montana at some point.
Awesome. I'm game.
Be well.
God bless. I want to thank the whole community of Montana and Boseman for everything you do for the Rabbi and the Rebbetzin, for Rabbi and Rebbetzin Brook.
And Rabbi and Rebbetzin Vogel, Rabbi and Rebbetzin Wolf.
Rabbi and Rebbetzin Vogel, Rabbi Rebbetzin Wolf. All of you I know are steadfast supporters emotionally and spiritually and financially and physically and on so many levels. And living a little far, living here in Rockland County in New York, I don't have an opportunity to speak to you every day, but all of you are a tremendous source of inspiration and encouragement and empowerment. And we always grew up, and Montana was just seen as this remote spiritual desert. But once Chabad came to Montana, it's starting to look more promising than a lot of other places that are very popular. And it's incredible what you guys are doing. And chazak, from strength to strength. We love you, and we send all of our blessings and deepest wishes for success, happiness, abundance. I don't know how many people could say that at their events they get 50% of the community, 20% of the community, 10% of the community. Here, somebody does an event, if they get 0.0%, they're happy. But you bring out 20%, 30%, kol hakavod. Montana, incredible. A Yid goes to Montana with his wife. They don't have their own children. They adopted children, including black children. And they're raising an amazing family there. And they brought close to Yiddishkeit hundreds of Jews. Something special, a lot to learn from.
This class is brought to you by theyeshiva.net. Please help us continue the classes. Make even a small contribution at www.theyeshiva.net/donate.